I hope this works now. So, thank you so much for taking the time, Dr. Lauren Colenso-Semple. Is it okay if I call you Lauren?
Yes, of course.
Okay. So, for all the people who don't know you yet, could you give us like a brief introduction of who you are and what you're doing?
Sure. I'm a researcher and science communicator, and my specialty is female physiology, and particularly as it pertains to resistance exercise and programming and muscle physiology.
Okay, so what was your like subject in university? Did you do like biochem or?
Yeah, I have an undergraduate degree in psychology. I have a master's degree in exercise physiology and a PhD in integrative physiology, where I really focused on the influence of female sex hormones on various muscle outcomes and performance outcomes.
Okay, so we should get right into the topic. Could you give us like a overview of the scientific literature? What does it say about like adapting training to the menstrual cycle?
When we look at the literature as a whole, there are some issues with the quality of some of the studies, but overall, we see a huge individual variation across cycles. And so there really isn't any evidence to support these phase-based or cycle synced programs that are kind of one size fits all that instruct you to adjust your training or your diet based on a particular menstrual cycle phase.
So just to clear that up for the viewers, like with inter-individual, you mean like differences between between the same individual over like a period of time. So you don't have not only have like differences between individuals, you have differences in the individual itself, right?
Both, absolutely. So, one of the problems with adopting a program that assumes you have a particular cycle length or assumes you have a particular ovulation timing, which dictates phase length, the issue with that is between women, there are so many different phase lengths and cycle lengths. So, a normal cycle could be as short as 21 days or as long as maybe 37 days. And then, as you said, even in the same woman, from one cycle to the next, perhaps there are differences in the total length or the timing of ovulation, meaning the length of the phases might not be equal, or they might not be consistent from one cycle to the next.
So if like hypothetically, if I wanted to adjust my training to my cycle, I would have to do it like basically all over again and check for ovulation. Is there any like measurement I could do like at home to do that, or would this require a lab setting?
You can measure your ovulation with a urine reactive strip. So people will use this when they're trying to track ovulation for fertility purposes. And that is an indicator that luteinizing hormone is spiking, which is sort of a predictor that you are going to ovulate shortly. And you could do that, but you wouldn't necessarily have an idea of the actual hormone fluctuations, from day to day or week to week throughout the cycle, unless you measured them with blood tests, with regular blood work.
Okay, so let's get even into more details. Like, what can you say about like different stuff? For example, you said it's not really reasonable to adjust training to your menstrual cycle. So does this impact only like training performance? Does it impact protein synthesis, or like what are basically like the outcomes, or like what was checked for in those studies?
So, a lot of the proposed mechanisms of why performance or adaptations to exercise would be better in one phase or one portion of a phase as opposed to another is based on this assumption that the hormone profile would somehow be more anabolic or more catabolic. So, better for muscle building or better for performance or worse. And The hypothesis was sort of generated from some animal model data that showed an effect of the absence of ovarian hormones on the maintenance of muscle. But that's a very different research question and obviously wasn't done in humans. And so that doesn't seem to translate to the short-term fluctuations that we see. And the idea typically with the programs that are marketed, they'll say something like, for the first 2 weeks of your cycle, you should focus on resistance training, or you should lift heavier, or the second 2 weeks, you either shouldn't lift weights, or you should just do some yoga and light stretching, or you should decrease the intensity. Those types of recommendations are typically what we're seeing.
What's your explanation for this? Do you think it's just like a marketing ploy, or is there anything like substantial to it?
Yeah, it comes from a kernel of science, I would say, but we need to be very careful about looking at a potential mechanism and then fast forwarding and applying it to our training or nutrition or other types of lifestyle habits before it's really properly proven in humans. And so I think ultimately it really is a marketing thing at this point because the science is not strong enough to support making really meaningful changes to the programs. What I'm seeing is people are substantially decreasing their overall training volume by implementing some of these programs.
Yeah, like, but I think it's safe to say that like a lot of women during the second part of their menstrual cycle feel a little bit like less energetic, maybe a little bit less motivated, maybe a little bit less strong, like subjectively. Does it make sense to adapt anything at all? Or would you just say like stick it out and you can basically perform the same way as as during the first part of the cycle or
So a lot of these programs that are recommended are based on the high estrogen versus high progesterone. And so they're not really looking at the time of the cycle where you would probably have menstrual symptoms, things like fatigue or bloating or abdominal cramps. That typically occurs at the very end or the very beginning of the cycle. And that's actually when all of the hormones are low. So I think it certainly makes sense to, if you don't feel well on those days, perhaps switch up the intensity of what you're doing, maybe skip the gym if you need to. But I don't think we need to pre-plan many, many days of adjustments. I would use an auto-regulatory approach to say, hey, I'm not feeling great today. Maybe I will step back a little bit, the same way that I would if I were jet lagged or during a period of high stress or not sleeping well, that I would approach it very similarly to that.
so basically just make adjustments on the fly depending on how you feel, maybe adjust training intensity a little bit, maybe adjust volume a little bit if you feel like fatigue, but nothing like pre-planned, saying like, oh, this is my proposed week, third week of the cycle, which maybe it isn't. And like just as you go, adjust, right?
Exactly. And I would point out that when we actually look at the subjective feeling versus objective performance metrics, often you'll see that they don't line up. So maybe I lifted the same weight today or ran the same pace and distance, and it didn't feel as good, but the time was the same or the weight was the same. Like, so often, even though you don't feel that you had as good of a lift, or maybe, your RPE was higher, the performance is still the same.
That's the same thing I witnessed when I was still coaching female powerlifting clients. Sometimes they wrote me, I don't feel well today, going into the session, blah, blah. And it's this week of my cycle and I'm not feeling good. I said, just get in there, see what you can do, and we're going to assess afterwards. And like sometimes they even came home with like PRs. And like
Yeah.
I wasn't feeling good, but then I was warming up and everything felt okay. And so like you said, it didn't really line up what they were feeling before the session or during the session and what they actually achieved performance-wise. That, yeah,
Yeah, and there's also a psychological component to all of this, right? So if you as a coach tell me as your client, you're not going to feel well this week, you're going to perform worse, you're because of your where you are in your cycle, you're already putting that in my head. And so even just by you putting that in my head is not good for an athlete
that
because there is a psychological component to
that
performance.
that's my main gripe with all those programs is basically they're dishing out nocebos. So they're saying, oh, this time you're gonna feel bad and we're gonna adjust the training volume beforehand and the intensity. And of course, if I say it with enough authority and enough times, of course people are gonna feel bad and they're gonna feel, oh, I can feel my performance decreasing. Like, of course they do. While on the topic, is there any literature on the issue of like higher injury risk during certain phases of the cycle, or is it like basically the same for all weeks?
Yeah, the research on this isn't very high quality, mostly because we're looking at injuries, after the fact. They're not really rigorously tracking cycles in terms of ovulation or hormone levels. And often not taking into account various other factors that could contribute to injuries. And so the unfortunate part of this is that for a lot of female sports teams, somebody gets injured, and the first question asked is, oh, where were they in their menstrual cycle? When really, perhaps you should be looking at their overall training volume, their nutrition, their sleep, their recovery, so many other factors that could really influence risk of injury. So again, we're looking at a mechanism about hormone levels potentially affecting, connective tissue, turnover or elasticity, but we're not really seeing that pan out in larger samples when you look at injury rates.
You mentioned several times that the data collected in those studies and in the other ones weren't as of high quality as they should be. Like, what were the main issues with that data? Like, what did they do wrong? What could have been done better?
If you're going to attribute a particular finding to hormone profiles, it's very important that you actually measure hormones. And many of these studies do not measure hormones.
What did
Many
they
of these
did
studies,
measure?
many of them assumed that everybody had a 28-day cycle and ovulated on day 14. So equal length phases, but didn't actually track it and didn't actually measure hormones. And so then you get to the conclusions and they say, well, during the follicular phase, this and this happened due to the high estrogen, but estrogen was never measured. And you're not even sure if they were in the follicular phase. So that's a big problem. Another issue is that some studies include hormonal contraceptive users with naturally cycling participants, meaning you have the contraceptive users who have a completely different hormone profile. They don't have a menstrual cycle, and they're all lumped in together with women whose hormone profiles are constantly changing. So that's a big problem as well. And it's difficult to do this research well. It's time consuming. It has to be very individualized. It's resource intensive because it's not easy or comfortable for the participant to have multiple blood draws to measure hormones from the point of view of timing, bringing people in, you have to constantly have them tracking their ovulation and you're in communication with them so you can bring them in at exactly the right time. So it's having done this myself, I understand why some people shy away from doing it, but it's very problematic that the bulk of the literature is really low quality in some of the important elements of the
Yeah,
methods.
but like assuming without measuring a 28-day cycle for everyone makes the data, at least from where I'm sitting, like almost worthless. Like you could have someone
I
in there
agree
with
with you.
like 23 days 34, and like things start shifting and not lining up as well. Like that's basically the data can't be used.
I mean, I agree with you. I've seen cycles, as I said, as short as 21 days, as long as 37 days. I've seen ovulation as early as day 9 and as late as day 23. So you think about that level of variability. And what it also means is that some people have unequal length phases. So perhaps you have a 30-day cycle, but you ovulate on day 9. That means your follicular phase is much shorter than your luteal phase, which introduces another issue if you were trying to do any sort of cycle phase based program, because now you're doing whatever the follicular phase program is for a much shorter time than you're doing whatever the luteal phase program is, assuming you're actually aligning it to your cycle, which most people are not, because most people do not track their ovulation.
Did you have a look? I know some programs, but I haven't seen that much. How do those programs like deal with the menstrual cycle? Like, what do they propose? Do they propose any measuring, or are they assuming 28-day cycles as well? And just like say, oh, day 14, ovulation, next week, you might ha already be PMSing maybe a few days later, and that's about it. Or like, is there any individual approach, or it's just like cookie cutter 28-day?
For the most part, it's cookie cutter 28 day. And so it would either be, 14 days of this and 14 days of that, or it might be 7 days, 7 days, 7 days, 7 days.
But that's going to be interesting, especially like if you have a little bit longer cycle and like your menstrual bleeding hasn't started yet and you're at the end of the program. It's like, what I'm going to do next? Okay, yeah. You mentioned oral contraceptives. Is there anything particular to those kinds of people that use oral contraceptives that should be like accounted for, or is it like they don't have any cycle, they have steady hormones all throughout, or I know there are like different kinds of oral contraceptive with different dosages and stuff like that, but is there like anything that can be said for oral contraceptives?
Yeah, so when you introduce a hormonal contraceptive, you're introducing an exogenous hormone, and that shuts down your endogenous hormone production. So if we were to measure your hormone profile in an or hormonal contraceptive user, it would just be low the whole time. And when we look at things like exercise performance and muscle adaptations, we don't see a large effect in either direction. When you look at the studies, some show, oh, it's a little bit better if you're on a hormonal contraceptive. Some studies show, oh, it's a little bit worse if you're on a hormonal contraceptive, but it's very, very small effect in either direction. So I would say, use an individualized approach to that. There are a lot of other reasons why you might a particular oral contraceptive or other type of contraceptive might not work for you. Some of them have side effects, some of them take a little bit of time to get used to. So I would just say if you're somebody who is tracking your performance and you're a fitness enthusiast or you're an athlete, if you are starting a new contraceptive, just be mindful that it can take a couple of months for the body to get used to it. But overall, it shouldn't have large impacts on your performance or your adaptations to exercise.
While on the topic of like special populations, so to speak, like is there anything that could be said like for women with PCOS? I have a lot of followers that suffer from it. I don't know if that's the correct word, but they have PCOS, and they wonder if there's anything they should do differently than like people that don't have PCOS.
Unfortunately, we really don't have a lot of data on this. And the one of the issues is that the diagnosis of PCOS is very non-specific, meaning you need a couple of criteria, and one of them could be that you have higher testosterone levels, but not necessarily. And so sometimes PCOS is not diagnosed based on hormone levels. And so we wouldn't necessarily say, oh, this is going to affect your performance or your adaptations to exercise. So, A, we don't have a lot of research. B, PCOS, the diagnosis in and of itself allows for a lot of wiggle room, meaning you might be diagnosed based on a vaginal ultrasound without ever testing your hormones, or you might be diagnosed based on a single time hormone test without ever doing any further testing. And often the quote treatment for managing PCOS is to put women on a hormonal contraceptive and decrease the endogenous hormone production. So I'd say I don't see, at least broadly, why we would make any unique recommendations to those individuals, but part of that is due to a lack of research, and the other part is due to the differences between the women in that category.
Okay. So, like, as a practical takeaway, if somebody, we know now that we shouldn't adapt training or we should adapt it like on the go, depending on our needs or depending on the needs of the women. Um, is there anything that could be done like to attenuate the issues during the menstrual cycle? Let's say I have like usually issues around day 20 or something like that. Is there anything I can do to alleviate that, to like make the symptoms less severe, feel better? Is there anything that you can propose that like would help people?
If you have abdominal cramping, sometimes heating pad can help. Taking an anti-inflammatory like an ibuprofen can help. And some people will even use like a TENS unit and on a low setting
What's that?
to
I never heard that.
like a um like an electrical
Oh,
stimulation.
okay.
And those can help with that. In terms of feeling kind of fatigue or low mood, sometimes low intensity exercise does help, at least subjectively. Things like going for a walk, getting outside, light movement, as opposed to staying really sedentary. But typically, in most individuals, those symptoms will not last more than 2 days.
So maybe just like if you feel too bad, just stay home for 2 days and then continue your training as usual, and everything will probably be fine, right?
Yeah, but I would at least experiment with being a little bit active to see if it helps. Because the other thing is sometimes, if you're not feeling very well and all you're doing is focusing on that, then it can kind of make it worse. And so if you just find a distraction, which could be as simple as, like I said, going for a walk or just getting up, moving around, taking your mind off of it, then that might help as well.
My experience with female clients is like they were so, everyone was so different. Like some had like a little bit of PMS and like going for a walk really helped them. But like I had also had like some severe cases with real severe PMDD,
Hmm.
and they couldn't do anything, like literally anything. For example, they even had like problems like with muscle coordination. They tried squatting and almost fell over. It's like it was so bad. So it's like really an individual thing, I guess. So
Yes, and I would say if you do have symptoms that are that severe, you should go and see somebody because there are things that you can do to potentially address that and help with that because it's true that some women experience really debilitating symptoms and often they just kind of suck it up because they think, well, this is what I had. This is just the way that my period is. But it doesn't have to be if you can get some help from a medical professional.
okay, now your image just froze. I don't know why. Oh, now you're back again. Okay, so to sum this up, you would just like adapt your training on the fly. There's no need like for specific programs, nothing in particular that you would recommend, right? Or is there anything you want to add or tell the listeners?
No, I would say stay away from any cookie cutter, one size fits all program that is suggesting you make any pre-planned changes to your training program. It's likely that this training program doesn't even align with your personal cycle. And even if it did, making adjustments that drastically decrease your training volume or have you switch from one type of exercise to another on some random basis is probably not conducive to your goals.
Great. So, where can people find you and what have you lined up like for the future? Is there anything we should be like looking out for? Do you have any like book coming out or any studies that going to be published? What's next for you?
You can find me on Instagram at Dr. Lauren CS1. I'm also a partner of the Mass Research Review. You can find us at massresearchreview.com. And that breaks down the latest science in training, nutrition, supplements, sports performance, psychology, you name it, overall health. And we're for scientists who write about science in a way that is more understandable to the non-scientist. So I highly encourage you to check that out. And I recently published an article on menstrual cycle phase and muscle protein synthesis, and I have some work coming out on oral contraceptive pills.
I'm going to link all the things you mentioned down below. And I'm thanking you very much for your time. And yeah, bye bye.
Thank you so much.